then have a wide leaf there. So now what I'll do is, you can see it's pretty thin down here and then thicker up here. I'm going to make this longer, more of a taper, which means it goes from a thinner piece of metal to a thicker piece of metal. So make that a lot thinner. And then I'll use the round parts of the anvil, which is called the horn. Bend it around here. Then everything that you see that's round on the table, on the inside there, we'll be using the horn of the round parts of the anvil here. So I started the curvature of the scroll with spiral here, and then I'll beat it up a little bit more, and then
we got our meeting started. Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. And you've already gotten a taste of what you're about to see this evening, so thanks for being here. I'm Sue Hostetter, and I work with it's all volunteer, with the Mountjoy Historical Society. If you're a board member, just raise your hand if you're here tonight. Okay, if you're a member of Mountjoy Historical Society, raise your hand. Okay, if you're not a member of Mountjoy Historical Society, we would love to have your yearly support. And we have brochures out there. If you want to take one of those, it doesn't cost a lot. You'd be helping us a whole lot. So think about that. I think we'll start right now with make you get up one more time. Pledge of allegiance. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If you didn't sign in before you came in, it would be helpful for us to just have a handout. If you would just sign in or sign out, perhaps, before you leave, that would help us a lot. I think Phil Kling, we're going to keep this real brief. Phil Kling has, we highlight new acquisitions that we get, and Phil has one he wants to show you.
Okay.
Phil's our
Not yet?
No, yes, now. Phil's our
I buy
eBay.
stuff for the Historical Society on eBay. And actually, I think we already own most of what's available of Mount Joy items. And believe it or not, most of what we got left are, I have a piece of paper here. Most of what we have left are matchbook covers. And the best ones are in New Zealand. The guy from New Zealand owns this. So we've been talking. Okay, I got a hive, Cox's Hive Syrup bottle. And the fine print here says Cox's Hive Syrup for children in croup, 10 drops to a teaspoonful every 15 minutes until vomiting is produced. As an expectorant for adults, from 30 drops to a teaspoonful every 2, 3, or 4 hours. And our interest in this is it's by J.C. Groff, druggist and apothecary, West Mountjoy. So that's what our interest is in it. And the other thing I got this is called Grandpa's Salve. And it says Mountjoy Chemical Company, Mountjoy, Pennsylvania. I don't don't know who made it in Mount Georgia, but the people that made the can were very proud of it. It's stamped inside with a date, November 1903. It's still got salve in it, it's still pretty good if any of you have any itches. Good for itches and stuff like that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's just, so many interesting things. So if you have a chance afterwards, please feel free. There's other kinds of interesting objects in our museum. Well, this is part of the museum as well, but if you'd like to tour around our museum, we'll have that open for you. So please feel free to just browse around the other building. Let's see, I think that's the next program coming up. So, of course, after the program, you're invited to stay for refreshments provided by Peter and Joyce Summers. Thank you very much. And the next program coming up is on July 17th with Craig Hall and Cheryl Williams. And it's called The Evening with Ben Franklin. So I believe we're going to be hearing Ben Franklin talk. So make sure you join us for that. All right, I think without further ado, Ned, if you want any more introductions than what we've already got, Ned, you want to?
Yeah, some of the things have already been repeated that I'm going to be saying or going to be speaking about, but our speaker tonight is Andrew Reist, and he's going to talk about history and the tools of blacksmithing. He's going to talk about some of the tools that the blacksmiths use, some of the various types of metals that they use, and the various styles of ironworking that resulted. Andrew became interested in blacksmithing at an early age of 12 when he purchased his first anvil. He attended Amsterdam High School, and then when he was a sophomore there in 2015, he was able to establish the Oak Lawn Blacksmith Shop, Oak Lawn being on the Eaton Road north of Lancaster. After graduating from high school, Andrew had an interest in the decorative arts, which he used to believe in his blacksmith work. Speaking about the decorative arts, he decided to enroll in Tennessee Tech University, where he majored in art education, right. And he's teaching down there now during the school year. It is in Columbia, Tennessee, but he returns here to Lancaster over the summer to conduct some of his blacksmithing business. Of course, he had a great deal of help with being an apprentice over the years. He had some expert people helping him to learn the trade, so to speak. He started out with the simple blacksmith tools, the kitchen tools, and then the candlestick holders and the trivets, and moving on to andirons. And I also think that he did some railings, but according to Andrew, you did or didn't?
I do. Yeah, I've made a couple railings, only like 2 of them. I don't do that all the time. Okay.
But now his major interest, as you can see, is andirons. And he produces those.
Anvils.
Anvils. He manufactures them from, they range from 10 pounds to over 1,000 pounds. That's his major interest now. We were going to go outside and have a demonstration, but we already did that, so we don't have to do that now. So Andrew, if you want to do your presentation.
Thank you, Mike.
Yes.
Works.
Yes.
That goes.
Yep.
As Ned said, I'm Andrew Reist. I currently teach in Santa Fe, Tennessee, which is southwest of Nashville, about 45 minutes southwest of there. I teach kindergarten all the way to 12th grade, works, and then I come up here to Pennsylvania anytime I get a chance to do blacksmithing, as well as make anvils and other blacksmithing tools. I was raised in Lancaster County by Lancaster Bible College, and I have a mentor here that when I was about 10, 12 years old, I started blacksmithing with him. So it's good to see him here. So I'll be talking a little bit about the history and tools of blacksmithing. Each slide, I'll go over a brief introduction of blacksmithing here. Each slide can last 45 minutes in itself, but it's hard to cover all those slides. So what is a blacksmith? A blacksmith is a person that shapes and forges out different pieces of metal by heating steel or different pieces of metal and shaping it using fire like we did outside there. And then a smith is a person who works with metal. Does not have to be steel, can be copper, it can be a white smith who works with metal but leaves a file finish. So you can use a file to get a nice clean finish on that. That would be a white smith. And then a tinsmith who also works with sheet metal, can be copper as well as other metals. And then we'll talk a little bit about the first history of metal. The first metal was discovered back in 7000 BC in Syria, right up here, so that was a long time ago. The reason why they found lead melts around about 621 degrees Fahrenheit. So when they were cooking their food over a fire, they would find that there was different metals in the ground that would start melting. So at that time, they would start using lead, which they found out recently, the last couple hundred years, that wasn't too good to use for cooking utensils as well as other tools, because you can lead to bad health effects there. And then we'll be talking about the Copper Age as well, which was around 4500 to about 2300 BC. So they transitioned from stone tools to metal tools. But just keep in mind, as we're talking about this too, that they still use stone tools up until about the 1800s. So they've been using Indian arrow beds and other artifacts that use stone all the way up to the 1800s. And then the earliest artifacts found from this age are from the Mediterranean Sea, right down here, right above Africa, south of Europe here. And then at this time, societies were experimenting with new tools and resources. Copper and gold were commonly found in this area, and then gold was too soft to use for making tools because you couldn't work harden it. Work hardening means is if you're hammering on a piece of metal, it's going to get harder and harder. Copper will work harden, but gold will not. So if you're hammering on gold, it's going to always stay soft. But copper, like weather vanes as well, weather vanes, like when you're hammering on it, they're usually made out of copper because when you're hammering on it, it will get harder and harder. But gold, that will still stay soft. So that's why they use copper for tools instead of gold. And gold wasn't as common either. And then here's some example of some Copper Age tools. We have some axes here, and then spears for hunting, as well as some other tools here. And then we get to the Bronze Age, which was around 3300 to about 1200 BC. Bronze was created using copper and arsenic by casting with sand. So casting, they would pour molten bronze and arsenic together. The reason why they combined the two is they would get a harder metal, because copper, that's going to be a lot softer than bronze is. And then casting, they would melt the metal and then pour it into a mold, which would be a sand mold. And then bronze is currently, as of today or nowadays, is 88% copper and about 12% tin. They stopped using arsenic because, as we know nowadays, they aren't. Arsenic isn't good for us. They also used to use lead as well in bronze, and lead isn't good for us anymore either. So now they use tin. And then due to the extensive process of mining and smelting metal, bronze was harder to produce. So they also didn't use it as often. And then at this time, flint and stone was primarily used for tools and weapons, and then bronze was also a symbol of social status since it was very hard to produce. Because you'd have to go through a whole process of melting it and then reshaping it using different tools to shape it to its final form. You couldn't just hammer it into a shape, it has to be poured out. And then starting around about 300 BC, civilizations were using tin with copper to make bronze. So they eventually found out that arsenic probably wasn't good for you, so they started using copper with tin. And here's an example of a sword or an artifact that they could make. And you can see here that they would have a small fire, almost like a forge outside there. They would heat the metal over a forge or a fire, and then have molten bronze in here, and then have a ladle, which they could pour the ladle into the final form. But they would still have to sand it as well for stones. And then here's some examples of some Bronze Age tools. Then we finally get to the Iron Age. Iron Age was around 1200 to about 600 BC. The highest temperatures of smelting iron limited the ability for most civilizations to work with iron before the Iron Age. So like we had outside there, we used coal in order to heat the metal. I had to use, you probably heard me cranking the blower back there, that noise. As I increase the blower speed, the hotter the fire will get. So back before the 1200s, they didn't realize that you could use a blower to increase the temperature of the fire, which could melt the metal or iron. So they could now move on to the Iron Age. And then the earliest known forged iron piece is a set of beads, which was made out of meteor, which is almost 100% iron. And then civilizations with access to melting and forging iron were more technologically advanced due to iron being harder and stronger than bronze. So at this time, a lot of civilizations were battling against each other, and when they were battling, a person with a bronze sword, and they were fighting against a person with an iron sword would be harder, which would go through the bronze armor. So they would be winning more battles at this time, and more advanced. And then we get to the Bessemer process. This process was perfected by Henry Bessemer in the 1850s. So it's almost about 200 years old. At this time, about time to heat about 3 to 5 tons of molten iron was reduced from about 1 day to about 20 to 30 minutes. So it dramatically reduced the time to cast 4 different pieces of iron. And that wasn't too long ago. And there's still a company called Cattail Foundry where I get some of these pieces made that still uses this tool. This is outdated, but it's an Amish-run foundry. They still use the Bessemer process today of making their metal. It's an Amish-run foundry. They pour in brake rotors for your cars. That would be the base metal, and then pour it into this big Bessemer. And what would happen up here would be the fire here, and then molten iron down here, and then they would blow air, but it would just be a blower. It doesn't have pure oxygen. I'll talk a little bit about that the next slide here, but it's just air here. It doesn't have to be pure air for this. So it's 200 years old, and they're still using it. Amish are still using it today. You can see it's kind of a dangerous process. Not many people here are using eye protection or computer protection. It's all mechanical nowadays. And then, depending on the different type of steel, they would add different types of elements to harden or strengthen the steel. And then in 1968, the United States stopped doing this due to better control of the chemistry of the steel, because it's almost like chemistry where you mix all the metals together and elements together to get a perfect mixture of steel. Because back in the 1800s, early 1900s, it was almost like just adding different elements. It wasn't very mathematical. It was within a couple pounds of the metal, but it wasn't perfect. But nowadays, they use forced oxygen, pure oxygen. The difference between back in the 1800s, they would have a blower which would have carbon dioxide and other elements as well, compared to pure oxygen. Because oxygen pushes in more air, but it doesn't have any impurities, which can push in impurities into the metal. And then we'll talk a little bit about handmade versus machine-made. You can see a corner piece here, or shelf brackets that was machine-made compared to a steel piece scroll that I made here. And how you can spot the difference between a machine-made piece and a handmade piece is a machine-made piece, they always, or almost always, have a flat piece of metal here at the end here, where the machine would grab onto the end and bend it around to make that spiral here. Compared to when I'm hammering on a piece of metal, I can get just the curve, it's going to hammer on the anvil, that curvature right at the edge here. It's not flat at the edge here. And I can get almost a perfect spiral there. So that's how you can tell how the piece of the machine made, a Lowe's piece that you can get from Lowe's or Home Depot, compared to a piece that's blacksmith made by one of us. And then I'll be talking a little bit about different types of iron steel. I can go into a lot of math and science behind this, but we'll just cover the basics of the different types of steel in iron. So we have a mild steel. This is the railing that I made for a relative of mine. Used for gates, railings, hinges, bridges, hardware, and non-impacted uses. For example, anything that you can think of pretty much that we use every day, that's steel, is usually made out of mild steel here. That doesn't have to do with anything hitting on it. So if you hit on this piece of metal with a hammer, it's going to dent. Then we have raw iron. A lot of people say, oh, I have a raw iron railing, I have a raw iron fence. The reason why it's usually not raw iron is it usually doesn't have this grain structure to it. In order to be technically raw iron, it has to have that 2% slag, 97% iron, and 0.1% carbon. So it's almost pure iron, but has that slag in as well as carbon in it. And they stopped making this back in the 1970s due to it being more expensive to produce, as well as it's a lot cheaper to produce mild steel nowadays. And then these can be used for hinges, railings, gates, and pretty much anything handmade. And you can tell the difference between a regular piece of metal and a wrought iron piece of metal. It has this grain structure to it, almost like a wood pattern does. So that's how you can tell if it's actually wrought iron or not, if you see this grain structure to it. Then we have tool steel. Most of the anvils that I make are made out of tool steel. It's, a couple of different examples are 1045, H13, S701. So S7 and 01, those are also foil hardening. So when you're heat treating or when you're making a piece of metal hot, it softens it. But then if you want to make it harder, you can either dip it in oil or water. So there's certain types of metal that you can dip in water, and then there's certain types of metal that you can dip in oil. Because, for example, if I get a piece of metal hot, for example, H13, and I dip that in water, there is a possibility of it cracking because the water will cool down too quickly. So I have to dip it in oil, which cools it down just a tad bit slower, but it will harden it but not crack it. So there's a bit of a science behind that as well. And here's some examples of drills and different tools and punches that are made out of tool steel. Then we have cast iron. Cast iron, ductile and malleable, used for tools, equipment, skillets, and specialty items. Some people use cast iron skillets for cooking. A lot of people still do that. And cast iron, what's the Dutch ovens? Yes, a lot of people still use those as well. Those are nice to use as well. Some parts can be identified by cast or the parting line from the casting. You can see on this anvil here that was poorly cast. You can see the parting line. So half the mold would be on this left-hand side, half the mold would be on the right-hand side. So you can usually see that there's a parting line on it. As well as some of the anvils that are cast, for example, some of these up here that have the lettering that faces forwards that comes out, that is usually cast. When I'm done with the talk, you guys can come up here and look at some of these anvils that the lettering will stick out compared to the anvils that the lettering is pushed in. And then some railings as well as gates are also cast as well. And I won't talk a whole lot about the different percentages. It's a lot of math and science. But basically on the level here, so we start off as a soft piece of metal down here, Grinnell hardness. The harder the piece of metal is, the more brittle it's going to become. You can see impact here, but pretty much how hard it is percent. So as you increase the carbon percentages, So the more carbon elements that you add into the piece of metal, the harder it will become. For example, a metal file that you use for filing metal, those will be pretty hard because they have to file other pieces of metal. So they have to be a lot more, they'll have to be a little bit more brittle than other pieces of metal. And a little bit less soft. Then we have screws up here, drills are up here as well as files. That's there. And then we'll look at close-up pictures. These are microscopic pictures of the different types of steel. And you can see here, all these black spaces here, this is all carbon, so it's almost like a structure to it. You can see how far apart the carbon is. It's not clumped together. Almost looks like a spider web. And then we look at tool steel. Tool steel, that will have a lot more carbon in it. You can see there's little molecules here. They're more tightly packed together. That means it's going to be a lot stronger together. Then we have raw iron. There's a lot of these black spaces in here. Do you remember how I said there's a lot of impurities in it, which means makes the grain structure to it? All these black pieces, those are the impurities, large chunks of impurities into metal. And these little dots, those are the pieces of carbon. So it's a lot more spread out, which means it's a lot softer. And then we have cast iron, which is around 1.7 to 3.7% carbon. And then we can see the black spaces here. These are the pieces of carbon. And then it's kind of hard to see, but there's little gray areas here. Those are probably the air pockets in a casting, because casting is not quite perfect. There's always going to be little bubbles in a casting because the metal isn't poured together in a perfect system. It's always going to have little air bubbles in it. So there's little gray particles like here, up here as well, little tiny air bubbles in it. So cast iron isn't quite perfect. Then we have steel forging colors. When we were outside, it was kind of hard to see the different temperatures, but usually we forge around about 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right around down here, which is almost like a cherry red color, about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about up here, which is a yellowish color. And then forge welding temperature is around 23 to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Forge welding is when you heat up a piece of metal so hot that it fuses itself together, binds itself together to create one single piece. So it'll heat up so hot that it combines itself. And then steel is also able to be melted and burned in the fire. If it gets above 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, like I was saying outside, there's a possibility of that melts, because the fire will heat up to about 3,000 degrees and get too hot and just melt metal, sparkles, and then you can't use the piece of metal anymore. I've had that happen quite a couple times, and it's not fun after you've spent 30, 40 minutes on a project and then you ruin it by burning it up in the fire. And then here's a little spoon rest I made, which is right around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you can see these little pieces of black spaces here. Those are called scales. So as you're hammering, you probably notice that there's little pieces of metal coming off the metal that I was hammering. That will typically happen because of oxidation is basically rust, but it comes off as you're hammering them. And it just naturally happens because it has layers on the different pieces of metal. It's micro chips of metal, but it'll still happen naturally. Then we have different tools of the blacksmith here. This is me working at the Amish house a year or two ago with fire, with coal forge. And then coal forges are used to heat the metal and soften the metal, and burns bituminous coal, like I said before. And the coal usually heats up possibly about 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit at the max. The forge out there, I wasn't heating up that much. I was heating up to about 3,000 degrees because I wasn't cranking all the time. If I continuously cranked the forge, then the metal would get too hot and burn, so I didn't want to have to heat up too hot. And then I'll probably have heard of too many irons in the fire. Raise your hand if you've heard of that. So that means you have too many things to do at once. The reason why I came up with that, back in the 1700s, 1800s, is blacksmith, he would have 2 or 3 pieces of metal in the fire at once, and then if he was busy doing something else or working on another piece of metal, the one piece of metal would burn up and then result in a failure for the heads. So that's where the saying comes from, the blacksmith shop. And then we have bituminous coal. I'll pass out some of the examples here. I'll just pass out this bin here. So we start out with bituminous coal, which is a soft coal. It's a mineral from the ground, usually mined from northern Pennsylvania or Kentucky, or as well as South Carolina sometimes as well. And then we have coke. After the coal has been burned up a little bit and burns some of the impurities out of it, it'll come up with coke. You can also buy coke as well, but it's a little bit more expensive than coal. Coal for a 50-pound bag is about $5 to $6 a 50-pound bag, so it's not too expensive. And I go through a 50-pound bag about every 2 to 3 days, just depending on how big of work I'm making or how big of fire I'm using. And that'll last by about 30 hours worth of work. Then after it's been completely burnt, it'll turn into a clinker. A clinker is a piece of coal like this, or a couple pieces of coal that burn out, and then you can't use them anymore. This is all the impurities in it. So you can pass these around if you want to. There's a couple different pieces in there. It's not toxic. It might get your hands a little bit dirty though. And then we have propane forges. I mainly use a propane forge at home due to the work that I make. I make a lot of leaves and spoon rests, as well as a lot of pieces that are repeat the same process over and over again. So it's a little bit easier for me to use a propane forge. So usually a propane forge will heat up about 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit and then maintains that temperature. So it doesn't cool down like a coal fire will. Coal fire will heat up to about 3,000 degrees, then go down to about 1,500. And then as you add air to it, it heats back up and then cools down. Compared to a propane forge here, it'll continuously heat to about 2,600 degrees. And then you won't burn the metal. That's what I like about using a propane forge. I can heat multiple pieces up at the same time, and it won't burn the metal here. So it's a little bit easier to use here. Then we'll talk about anvils. I collect a lot of anvils from around the world, so we'll talk a little bit about them. Anvils, like the one I was using outside there, they're used to form and shape different pieces of metal. They're cast, forged, or cast and forged together. There's different types of metal, and then you can manipulate them depending on what style anvil you want to make. And then the first anvils, they were made out of a large block of steel during the Iron Age, and then originally had a tool steel face with a raw iron body. And then we'll talk about the London pattern anvil here. The anvil I was using outside there, that was made out in Ohio back in the early 1900s. They're out of business today, but that was a London pattern anvil. So we'll start at the front here by the horn. The horn is the round part of the anvil. So anything that's made round, we can use a horn. And then we have the table. The table is for cutting different pieces of metal. We'll use a chisel to cut the different pieces of metal because the table here, that's going to be softer. You don't want to use a chisel to hit the top or the face of the anvil here and dull the chisel or damage the anvil. Then we have a hardy tool. I'll pass around a hardy tool. This is a cutoff hardy. This is for cutting off different pieces of metal. Has almost like a wedge shape to it. So what I do is set a piece of metal on top here and then cut off the different pieces of metal using this. So it fits in the square hole. It's in there. You get a bigger end. It probably fits the anvil outside there. But this is a hardy, cut off different pieces of metal. Pass that around as well.
Against the tree profile real well.
Yep. So it fits in right in here.
Yeah.
Some square hole anvil. And then we have the Pritchell hole. The Pritchell hole is for punching different pieces of metal. So we would get a drift, which is basically a metal tool that's hard and can punch a hole through different pieces of metal. That's what the pritchel hole is for. Then we have the body, the main body of the handle here. We have the throat, which is the back of the handle, and then the waist of the handle here, as well as the feet, the bottom of the handle here, as well as the base. And then we'll talk a little bit about the English weight system handle. Most handles that are made over in Europe use this system of measurements. If they're made in the United States, they'll have pounds on it, usually on the front foot. If it's like the handle I have out front here, it'll have the weights up front here compared to an English style or a European style handle will have this system of measurements. Now, this is one of the handles I have at home here. Was made by Ashbourne Hampton in England. So it has a 2, 2, and 18. So what we do is do 2 times 112, because this is the English style of measurements. So it'd be 2 times 112, which is 224 pounds. And then 2 times 28, 28 would be the second measurement. We also multiply the second one by 28, which is 56. And then the last measurement is pounds, which would be 18 for this. So 224 plus 56 plus 18 would be 298 pounds worth. So
Can I just point out to you?
Yes.
The word that you said where it was made is actual fact an abbreviation. The word is Wolverhampton.
Wolverhampton.
Yeah.
Where is that?
It's in the Midlands,
Oh,
near Birmingham.
Oh, okay. Wow. Because I got this this handle probably about 4 years ago, and he imported it from England about 5 years ago because he got it a year before I did.
Yeah, it's part of an area in England that's called the Black Country, which was because of the steel works and iron works that went on there, chains and nails and.
Wow, that's very interesting.
And it's not far from a big place called Ironbridge, which you may have heard of.
I have, yes.
Well, yes.
Yeah, because they made a lot of handles in this area probably. If they made a lot of iron work there, raw iron and other things, they probably made a lot of handles as well. Wow. And then we have early style handles. The first handle style was a block iron, and then as time went on, blacksmiths would add more and more surfaces to work on. And then the handle pictured here is made back in 1533, but this is not the earliest handle that we know of. This is just the earliest dated handle that we know of. And then here's a whole bunch of different style handles. My goal one day, this might sound a little crazy, but my goal is to collect every single handle style that there is. And so far, probably have 30 different style handles, and probably about 10 different styles here. Actually maybe 6 or 7 styles here. Because since I make handles, it's good to also know the history behind handles. And a lot of handles I have influence the style handles I make. So it's good to collect handles from other countries to know the history behind them as well. So the first one is a colonial style handle. The key features are a 5th foot here and a small hardy hole or a square hole in the handle. Some of them did not have a hardy hole or a square hole. And then these are made pre-1830s. They were typically made in England and then shipped to America in the bottom of the ships for ballast to offset the weight of the top of it. Down further. And then common manufacturers are mouse hole forge. The reason these were also mouse hole forge, they were made in England. And the reason why they have the 5th foot here, back in the 15, 14, 1300s, back in the early days, they would start making armor. And they added on this 5th foot. This is a handle made back in the early 1900s. They continued the tradition of the arched brow for the church windows with the 5th foot on it to use for armory. It's kind of hard to see. Maybe once finished with the talk, we'll come up here and look at the handle. But they have 2 curves here. These would be for making the armor. And you can set a piece of sheet metal in here to create curves on the ironwork as well. So that's where the 5th foot originally came from. The earliest anvils, these probably are made, these two anvils are probably made in the 1800s, probably late 1700s, early 1800s. The earliest anvils would have a curve to them, like the front anvil here, the Bavarian style anvil, where it has one piece instead of it just sticking out. This is more for decoration, even though it's made back in the 1800s as well. Then we have a London pattern or English pattern anvil. They first appeared in England in the early 1700s. Common manufacturers are Haybutton, which is made in New York, Fisher, which is made in New Jersey, Peter Reist, which is made over in England, as well as Mousehole Forge, which was made over in Sheffield, England. And then one of the first major producers of anvils was Mousehole Forge in Sheffield, England, which made them from 1628 to 1933. So that's 200 years, 250 years of business, generation after generation would be continuing the business. So it's kind of sad to see nowadays that a business will go out of business after 50 years, after one generation of running the business. Then we have the North German style. These are one of the top anvil manufacturers I like. They're double horn, which means they have a point on this side as well as a square point on this side. They have a Hardy hole, square hole up here, as well as a Pritchell hole in the back towards the square horn. They have an upsetting block here, and sometimes a side shelf. I don't have a side shelf on this one, but a side shelf on the smaller anvils here is when, it's kind of hard to see, but if you're getting a piece of metal, it adds a little bit of more width to the top of the handle. If you have a large piece, it's easier to just set it on top here. As well as when you're hammering a piece of metal and you're making a scroll or a spiral, you can hammer it and it curves around. You can see it curves this brow, or the side shelf curves inwards a little bit here. So you can use a scroll and it curves downwards. Unlike the London pattern anvil or other pattern anvils that don't have a slide shelf, is that it will hit the side of the anvil here. And these are specifically for German style anvils for them. One of the most longest running German manufacturers is Reiflinghaus. They still operate today after being in business since 1783. I was talking to the guy who speaks German. I talked about 2 or 3 years ago. He was saying that his sons, which are probably about 50 years old, don't want to make anvils anymore because it's not worth making it anymore. So after this generation, after 200 and some years, almost 300 years, they're going to stop making anvils next 5 years. So it's kind of sad to see, so I want to try to get one, a brand new one that they make. I have one right up here, the double horn anvil, that was made probably 30, 40 years ago. And then these were made out of 6 different pieces. They would, main body, this would be one piece. So this is a deconstructed view. So they would start out with 6 different pieces of metal and then forge weld them or fuse them together. So they would start out with this big block of metal. Then they would add on the horn, and they would forge weld, heat up to about 2,500 degrees, and fuse it together using big hammers and a lot of different people, and fuse them together. The horn here, this other horn, as well as the 2 feet here, upsetting block, the side shelf, and then the top plates. Back in the 1800s, I was talking about how metal was so expensive. It used to be more expensive than labor costs, because I was looking up an article and I found out that per pound it was about $1,500 to $2,000 per pound in current day prices for a pound of tool steel. So they would forge weld a piece of metal like the top here onto an anvil like this, about 1/4 inch to about 1/2 inch thick, because it was a lot cheaper to do tool steel top than do the tool steel the whole entire anvil here. So the rest of the anvil here would be wrought iron, which was a lot cheaper material at that time to get the cost down a little bit. And then we have the Bavarian, or South German style anvils. These have a sloped round with step feet a hardy hole, and then they have a pritchard hole as well. And then these are the anvils I make today. They have a brow on the front here or a sloped brow. So as you're, piece of metal, but for example, the tongues here, as I'm hammering on a piece of metal, if you have a striker that has a large hammer, say 5-10 pound sledgehammer, and you're hammering, and this strike hits here and slides off the brow of the anvil, compared to a London pattern anvil, one over there, but compared to a London pattern anvil or German style anvil like this, if you miss strike, what's going to happen is it's going to chip the edge of the anvils here. That's why some of the anvils are chipped on the sides of the anvils. If you have a 10-pound hammer, it's going to chip out the sides of the anvils here. So that's why they have a brow on the sides of these anvils. For the most part, most of these anvils I've seen, they're almost always in perfect condition on this side of the anvil because the brow, the other side's not perfect, but usually this side of the anvil's pretty good condition because of the brow here. And then they also used them to make sheet armor back in the early days as well. And then common manufacturers are sodding hallmark and Holt House. This is a sodding hallmark made in 1900, stated on here. And then these are the two anvils I made here too. Actually, 3 anvils I made. And then we have the Italian style anvils. So you have 4 feet that make an M shape. Starting down here, it kind of looks like an M. And they have a horn and a hardy hole in the back. You have a square hardy hole in the back here, as well as a pointed horn. And then these have a wider face than anvils in their weight class. So they'll be a lot wider. For example, this one here, if it was this weight, and for example, an anvil like this, it would probably be a 200-pound anvil, 300-pound anvil. So this is the Italian style anvil here. This weighs probably about 30 pounds. It's made in Italy. And these are, this one here is probably made early 1900s, 1910, 1920 probably. And then we have the Chinese anvil. They have a curved face and are usually within the 50 to 100-pound average size, depending on the style. And they usually don't have a hardy hole. See, this one here has a pritchard hole for making nails, and most of them were cast from tool steel or were cast iron. And common manufacturers, none that I know of. I have a friend that I just became friends with him about 2-3 years ago, and anvil over here, up front here, this is a Chinese anvil, directly imported from China. I should have brought the video along or presented the video. They're still back in the 1800s. Even though the cities are developed in the rural communities where they don't have a lot of equipment, they're still using without electric. They're still using hand-powered bellows. He sent me a video of the guy, he was still using a pump bellows and then using these anvils like this to still make hoes and farming equipment. So even though mainly in China it's developed, they're still back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So it's kind of impressive to see the difference between the technology nowadays between main cities and what they're doing out in the communities. But I have about 3 or 4 of them, ranging from about 8 pounds all the way up to about 50 pounds there. And then we have Cushmaker's anvils. These have a slide shelf, little shelf out here to make the brackets on carriages that hold the leaf springs together. I don't have one here, but a leaf spring is almost like a spring for our cars, but the side shelf would be to make staples. The staple is like a U-shaped piece, and it would go right below the spring, and then you put 2 nuts on it to tighten it down. So this little step here would be to make those staples. And those are originally from England back in the 1700s. And then we have a farrier's anvil. These are for shoeing horses. And they have a little clip here so that the farrier can draw out the toe clips on the horseshoes. I think I have a horseshoe down here. I did not make this, but you can see as an example of a toe clip, a little toe clip here. So the horse's hoof would sit down here and go up against here. You can pass this around here. I did not make this. This is cast. And then these were made back in starting out in the mid-1900s, so they're still modern. We used to have a saw maker's anvil. These are for setting the saw teeth on saws. They range from about 25 pounds up to 800 pounds. This anvil here is about 400 pounds. They have a typically harder anvil surface because the saw is pretty hard. And saws aren't, I'm not sure if you know, but saws are not perfectly in line like this. The saw teeth are offset like this, so as they're cutting, it's going to remove material as well. So they're just used to set the teeth here. And then they have a flat face, perfectly or almost perfect flat face without a horn on it. And then we'll cover a little bit of general blacksmithing tools here. Blacksmithing bit, also known as a stake anvil. They're a portable anvil that sits in a stump, and they would have a little spike, almost like the Hardy that we're passing around, but it would be a little bit bigger, and it would go into a stump of a log or ground, something like that. And they're usually used for smaller ironwork or more intricate pieces as well. They have a double horn, and they're usually made out of raw iron with a little tool steel plate up top here. And then we have good mantles. They're used to make rings. I have one right up here. You can make different size rings for harness, jewelry, and different things like that. They range from about 4 inches all the way up to about 7 foot tall. So far as I know, I have the tallest cone mantle in the country or the world, which is 7 foot tall. And then we have anvil Hardy tools. I think we're passing around the cut-off Hardy. These are to cut off different pieces of metal. They fit in that square hole of anvil. We were talking about the first anvil I bought. This is the first anvil I've ever bought. I was 12 years old. And then we have a blacksmith vise. These are used to clamp different pieces of metal. They differ from a machinist vise, in which they have a post which is sitting on the floor, so directly this piece here, the jaws, directly transfers all the energy as you're hammering up here, directly all the way to the ground here. So machinist device, if you're hammering on it, it's usually made out of cast iron or cast steel, and then if you're hammering on it, it doesn't direct any force onto the jaws, so it absorbs all that energy. Compared to a blacksmith device like this is forged or heated up and softened and forged using large hammers, directs all that force down to the ground here, which doesn't damage it then. Then we have tongs. These are to hold different pieces of metal. We pass these around too. These are 1/4 inch tongs to hold the different pieces of metal so you don't burn yourself, because you can't always hold a piece of metal that's 2 or 3 feet long. You have to sometimes hold a small piece of metal. Usually what I do is when I'm clamping a piece of metal and still holding them like this, I put my pinky in between here and open them like this to get a little bit better control over it. You can pass that around too. And then they're usually made from mild steel so they don't crack when cooling down in water. There's a whole bunch of different sizes, from flat tongs all the way up to round tongs or square tongs like the ones there.